Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf tzadichet, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov, Chanukah Sameach. We'll get started with our daf. So we had at the end of yesterday's daf, we tried to figure out this law that we've been discussing about the chatat swallowing, right? When the chatat, one piece of meat swallows meat flavor, taste from another sin offering, or a sin offering, whether it's chulin, whether it's kachim kalim, if it swallows from the other, that piece of meat, whatever it is, takes on the characteristics of the sin offering, or whatever it might be. So we said, with the pasuk, the context, and the reason why I said sin offering is because the context of those pasukim in chapter 6 of Vayikra, verse 20, where the pasuk appears, is specifically the sin offering. From where do we get that it applies to other offerings as well? So for that we saw that we have this pasuk, at the summary pasuk in Vayikra chapter 7, verse 37, at the end of all the section of the sacrifices, it says these are the rules for the Zot Torah, for the Olah, the mincha, l'chata, l'asham, l'miluim, l'zevachim. And now we're in the middle of darshaning all those words. We're going to learn the fact that all these things are juxtaposed in the verse. We're going to learn from each of these words some halacha that appears specifically there and can be taught to other places. So we talked about the Olah. Olah we learned it has to be done with a knife. All the others have to be done with a knife, not some sort of sharp implement. Then we learned from mincha that mincha is only eaten by male kohanim. Then we said, wait, but the shalmei tzibur, the public peace offerings, it already says in its own pasuk, we have a drasha, where it says, "B'kodesh kodeshim tochlenu kol zachar yochaloto," and they learn from there that they can only be eaten by male kohanim. To which the Gemara answers, starting with the very end of yesterday's daf, beginning of today's, Tinaihi, Ika denafka lemihacha, Vika denafka lemihacha. For the shalmei tzibur, some people learn it from our pasuk, from the mincha, and some people learn it from that other pasuk we just quoted about the shalmei tzibur, about the public peace offerings. So we have, as mincha teaches to all the other offerings, it's just a matter of, does it also teach to shalmei tzibur, or does that have its own pasuk? Chatat. What about the sin offering? What do we learn from there? We already know. That's why we're bringing this drasha. If something swallows the taste from another piece of sin offering, it's going to be sanctified just like it is. And we can learn from there to all the other sacrifices. Asham. What do we learn from guilt offering? Ma asham ein shafir v'shiliyah kadosh bo. Avkol ein shafir v'shiliyah kadosh bo. So the parts of the fetus, right, which might have fatty substances to them. If, let's say, a pregnant animal is brought as a sacrifice, and when they open it up, there's a fetus inside, well, the fatty parts inside there don't get offered on the altar. Now, how do we know this? We learn it from Asham. How do we know Asham it's not sanctified? Well, because Asham is always male, so there's not going to be a shafir and a shiliyah. There's no fetus in there. So because of that, they say, well, then we know that anything from, right, if this is, by the way, the umbilical cord or the fetus or, anything from there is not used. And we learn it from the Asham, where it's a male animal, and obviously there is no shafir or shiliyah. Now they say whoever the Tana of this source who does this drasha must hold two things. Number one, kasavar vladot kodashim v'havayatan hin kodoshim. Okay, the vlad of a sanctified animal is only going to be sanctified. Often we say the vlad of a sanctified animal is sanctified, but only when it's born, not when it's still in utero. And danim efshal misha'i efshal. And another issue, which is a broader issue, not just related to pregnant animals, can you learn a situation where it's possible from a situation where it's impossible? It's impossible for an asham to have a shafir and a shiliyah, right? To have a fetus in there. It's impossible. There's no way that could happen. So can you learn from there to a case where it's possible, like a sin offering? Well, according to this Tana, obviously you can't. So this Tana holds that you can learn a case where it's possible from a case where it's impossible. Some people think that you can't do that, and that's why they're saying, obviously, this Tana thinks you can. Miluim. What do we learn from the Miluim offerings? Ma Miluim motrehem b'sreifa. Okay, now in the Miluim, this is on when they consecrated the Mishkan in the desert. So there's a pasuk there. Let's see if I can quickly find it. In pasuk kaftet, parak kaftet, where it talks about the miluim, and it says there that if you have it left over till the morning, then you have to burn it. Okay, I'm trying to find it. Right. Okay. Pasuk Lamed Daled. V'im yivater mi basar hamiluim u'min alechem ad haboker. If you leave over from the basar, from the meat, or from the bread, v'sarafta tanotar ba'esh lo yachel ki kodeshu. Okay, and you have to, whatever's left, you have to burn, and you can't eat it. So now, what are we going to learn from here? Well, just like they're motrehen b'sreifa, if you leave over the meat, it's going to be burned. But ein ba'alei chayim b'motrehen. But you don't burn other leftover animals that are alive. What does it mean, a leftover animal that's alive? Let's say you designate 2 animals for a sacrifice, just in case something happens to one of them, and then you bring one of them, and the other one's still there. Well, that's called a motar. It's an unnecessary one now. Well, you might have thought you burn it. No. So just like by the miluim, you only burn the meat if it's left over, but not, right, if it's beyond this designated time, but not live animals. Af kol motrehem b'scheifa ve'em ba'alei chayim b'motrehen. Same thing with all other sacrifices. The notar will be burned, but you're not going to burn the live animals that are left over. Shlamim, last part of this drasha. What do we learn from peace offerings? This is very famous. We learned it already in the beginning of the Masechet, where we spent a lot of time on pigul. If you remember, the psukim that we learned pigul from are all talking about peace offerings. So they say, Mashlamim mifaglim u'mitpaglim, just like they create a pigul situation and can cause other things to become pigul, and they can become pigul themselves. We'll explain what that means in a minute. Av kol mifaglim u'mitpaglim, that is true for all other sacrifices as well. Okay, the mitpaglim is easy. That means they become pigul. If you have a pigul thought while you're doing the korban, right, then that meat becomes pigul. That's mitpaglim. It happens to them. But mifaglim is it could cause other things to become pigul. Well, what if I mess up my korban and I make it pigul? All the libations that go along with it are also pigul, right? Because they are things that are connected with that offering. So it could cause pigul to happen to fall onto, right, other things, or to be moved onto other things. Okay, so that was the first way of darshaning that pasuk. Okay, and that taught us what we were looking for. Where do we get this law from? That it's not only for a sin offering, it's also for other offerings as well. But there's a braita that has this in the name of Rabbi Akiva, a whole different way of darshaning this pasuk. And actually, we're going to learn our halacha from a completely different type of korban. Mincha, here we go. Ma mincha mitkadesha beviloa, av kol mitkadesha beviloa. Surprise, surprise. This pasuk also appears in a mincha, the same law. Okay, we're going to look at it. It's in the same chapter, Vayikra chapter 6. This section before, or 2 sections before, talks about zot Torah mincha. Here are the rules for the mincha. And then, in that section, in pasuk Yud Aleph, it says, Kol zachar b'vnei Aaron yochlena. Okay, the meal offerings are given to, the remainders are given to the kohanim. Chok olam ledorotechem. Okay, this is a rule. Misha Hashem. And then it says at the end of that pasuk, Kol asher yiga behem yikdash. Anyone who touches this, or anything that touches it actually, will be sanctified. Same exact thing. And it says it by a mincha. And this drasha says, we don't learn it from the chata to all the others. We learn it from a mincha to all the others. Now, before we go on in this braita, we're going to see what are they darshan them from chatat and what are they darshan from other words. It's a different version. Well, we're going to say, why do we need a pasuk both in mincha and in chatat saying the same thing? It's kind of taking a break in the braita. We'll go back to the braita in a minute. Itzrich lemichtav mincha ve'itzrich lemichtav chatat. You need both to be written. Why? De'iyash me'ina mincha de'ayde derakicha mibala. Well, mincha offerings are often softer. They're made from dough, even though they're kind of hard because they're matzah-like, but they're somewhat soft, and because of that, you might have thought they're very absorbent. Of a chatat that's meat, emalo, maybe it's not so absorbent, and therefore maybe this law wouldn't apply. Different people have different interpretations of what this is. Rashi says it means chatat is very thick. The piece of meat is thick and therefore absorbs a lot, almost like sponge-like. And it kind of gets inside because it's thick. And then that's why the flavor can get really absorbed into it. Aval mincha, which is kind of more flat, emalo, maybe not. Well, shricha. That's why you need both. Okay, but since we already learned from the mincha, this halacha, what are we going to learn from chatat? So this is going to be a bit strange, you'll see as the Gemara goes into it, which is chatat, ma chatat ena ba ela min achulin. So we're going to have 3 things we learn from chatat, which is interesting. Until now we've only had 1. But what do we learn from this? It has to come from money that's not sanctified at all, meaning not Maser Sheni money. If I have money that I redeem my fruits onto, and I'm supposed to bring them to Jerusalem to buy, I can buy all sorts of animals to bring as a korban, I can buy fruits to eat, I can buy all sorts of things, but I cannot buy a sin offering from that money. Uba Yom, okay, in a minute we're going to see where we get that from. Uba Yom, the chatat has to be sacrificed in the day, so likewise all sacrifices have to be done during the day. And biyado yamanit, all the actions have to happen with your right hand, likewise for all other offerings. So afkol, likewise all other offerings, ein aba ela min hachulin, number one, only from non-sacred money, ubiyom, during the day, ubiyado yamanit, and in the right hand. So the first thing we're going to do is figure out chatat minalan. How do we get that it can't be used, you can't buy it from Maser Sheni money? So they say, Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Kravi, Kriv Aharon et par chatat asher lo, Mishalo v'lo mishal tzibur v'lo mishal maaser. So it says Aaron sacrificed the par chatat. That was his. This is a chatat. It happens to be the unique chatat of Yom Kippur, but it says that belonged to him. What do we see from here? It has to come from his own money and not mishal tzibur, not from communal money, and not lo mishal maaser. Money owned by him, not money that was Maser Sheni money. So that's how we learn a halacha. We assume if that's a chatat, it's true for all chatats, and that's halacha we're going to learn to everything else. But there's two other halachot, which the Gemara is going to now question. Bayom, maybe Yom Tzavato Nafka. So we learn that from a completely different pasuk. Okay, we were in Vayikra Zayin, pasuk Lamed Zayin. That was our big pasuk with, this is the Torah, la ola, la mincha, la chatat, right? The summary pasuk. But there's really one more pasuk after. It really ends the whole section, which is Asher Tziva Hashem et Moshe, the next pasuk 38, which God commanded Moshe in Har Sinai, biyom tzavoto, on the day that he commanded. Here's going to be the drasha. Why does it say on the day? On the day that he commanded Bnei Israel to sacrifice their sacrifices to God in the desert of Sinai, the Sinai desert. So what do we say here? On the day God commanded them to sacrifice, from there you learn, the drasha is biyom tzavoto. During the day you have to do sacrifices, not at night. So how can you say that that was specifically for a sin offering, and from there we learn to all others, when there's a clear pasuk here that's talking about everything, and they darshan from there again? It's not the simple reading. The simple reading is he said it during the day, but because it says on the day he commanded him to do the korbanot, from there, right, he commanded Bnei Israel to do the korbanot, from there we learn that korbanot have to be done during the day. It's a drasha. But anyway, they say, so why is it here listed with the chatat? Well, kadei naspa, which is a very strange answer. It means, well, they just kind of mentioned it, but it's not really learning. It's not really learned from the sin offering. Why then mention it? I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay, next. Biyado hayamanit. Well, that also. Mida Rabbi Bar Chana nafka. Don't we learn it from Rabbi Bar Chana? To Amar Rabbi Bar Chana Amar Rish Lakish. He said the name of Rish Lakish. Kol makom shneimer etzba ukiuna. We learned this already. Eino ela yamin. When it says finger, it means right finger. And when it says kahuna, it means right. It has to be done with the right hand. So in all the sacrifices it says kahuna, maybe not all of them etzba, but they all say kahuna. So how can you say that we learn it from a sin offering specifically? Well, kadei naspa. Same answer. It's really doesn't belong here. They just mentioned it. So then the Gemara says, well, here we have a possible explanation where it really is specifically from the sin offering, and how so? You might remember this from when we learned it. Ibait ema savar ki Rabbi Shimon. He held like Rabbi Shimon, da Amar. And the Tana of this braita held like Rabbi Shimon. Etzba lo baya kahuna, kahuna baya etzba. If you just have finger, you don't need the word kohen to know it's the right. It has to be the right. But if you have kahuna, which is the one that appears in most of the places, because etzba, if you remember, the finger, specifically if the kohen uses his finger when? In the blood of the sin offering. So yes, that's right hand. But when it says kahuna without etzba, it doesn't mean right hand, according to Rabbi Shimon. So there you would actually need to learn it. Unless kahuna comes with etzba, it doesn't mean right. So then you would have to learn it from chatat, and from there you could learn to all the other offerings. Okay, last drasha here before we move on. We switch topics. Asham. So the end of that long drasha of the second version of how to darshan a pasuk. What do we learn from guilt offering? Ma asham atzmotav mutarin, af kol atzmotav mutarin. Well, in a korban asham, the bones are permitted. How do we know that? Well, it says in the asham, this is in chapter 7, the beginning of chapter 7, it says, Kachatat ka'asham torah lachem. Okay, the asham has rules just like the sin offering, and that's not important. But the continuation of that pasuk is, HaKohen asher yechaber bo lo yihiyeh. the Kohen who does the atoning, it will go to him. Now, what's the extra words lo yiyeh? It's to teach you even the bones go to him. So even though parts get sacrificed on the altar, the bones get to be enjoyed by the Kohen. So now what do you see here? Just like in Asham, the bones are permitted. Rashi says like to make vessels if you want out of them. Av kol atzmotav mutarin. Same is true for all other korbanot. And Rashi says the big chiddush here is the korban ola, which completely gets burned. And you would think maybe the bones get burned. It can't be given to the Kohen, but no, the bones go to the Kohen. Okay, what gets burned is the meat, but not the bones. Okay, now we move back to another topic. We started our chapter with the blood. If you remember, the blood that needs to get cleaned out of the clothes in the azara. They have blood from the korbanot on them. So Rav is going to have two sets of questions. One has to do with that, and the other one has to do with blood, but totally unrelated. Blood on clothing, but not the same kind of blood on clothing. We'll see in a minute. I'm a Rav. Both questions have the same format. Pshitali, it's obvious to me, and I was going to give a case. It's obvious, and then he's going to ask a question. It's obvious to me that dam, and now we're turning to Amud Bet, dam chatat lamata v'dam ola lamala. If you have a stain on your garment from the Beit HaMikdash, you're in the temple, and the blood sprinkles on you from the blood in the cup, and you have blood from a sin offering on your shirt, then you get dam ola on top of that. Lamata lamala means the first stain, and then a second stain goes right above that one. Talun kibus, of course it needs to be laundered because first you got sin offering blood on it and the blood got absorbed in the garment, needs washing. But by Rabbi, here's this question. Dam ola lamata v'dam chatat lamala. What if you have ola blood got there first and got absorbed in the garment, and then on top of that you got a stain of sin offering? Here are the two sides. Do we say mishum nogeahu? It's just if it touches your garment, and hanogea, and this is touching it. O dilma mishum biluahu. Or do we say it's what gets absorbed, the halobala? And this didn't absorb because it was already, the garment absorbed the first blood. It didn't absorb the second blood. The second blood is kind of on the outside. So maybe it doesn't need laundering. That was his question. Hadra Pashti. He then answered his own question. De'ein tu'unim kibus. It doesn't need laundering, okay, because it's not absorbed in there. So that was question one. Question two. Now we're moving on to a totally different topic, although it has to do with blood in a garment. But if you have blood in a garment and you want to, let's say the garment became impure and you want to tovel it, you want to put it in a mikvah. But if it has blood in it, the blood is what we call a chatzitza. It's an interposition between the garment and the water. And the mikvah. You can't put it in the mikvah with that stain in it. So Amar Rava, pshitali dam abigdo chotzetz. Obviously you have blood on your garment. That's an interposition. It's a chatzitza, as we call it. However, what we know about chatzitza, you might know, you might not know, but a chatzitza is something that you're planning to remove, and it bothers you. So if I have blood on my shirt, obviously it's going to bother me. I'm not going to walk around with a big blood stain on my shirt. However, im tabachu, if he's a butcher, and here they really mean a slaughterer, where the blood, you're always getting blood on your garment, and you don't really care, it doesn't bother you, because that's what you're dealing with all day long. Well, for you, it's not a chatzitza. Eino chotzetz. So for that butcher, that slaughterer, it's not a chatzitza. So here's a fascinating thing, which makes a lot of sense, that something that's an interposition for me might not be an interposition for you, because it might not bother, right? If it bothers you, it's a chatzitza. It doesn't bother you, you always have it there, and you don't make anything of it, well then, no. So, okay, so far that's what's obvious. Let's keep going with the obvious case. Revav al bigdo chotzetz. If you have something fatty on your clothes, like a big oil stain, you're going to want to get it off. Ve'im mocher revav hu eino chotzetz. But if what you sell is the fats, right, or maybe wax, some people say, right, which is kind of fatty and oily. So if you sell wax, then it's not going to bother you because you have it all over your clothes anyway. By Rava now asks, I wonder if this is still true today, right? Like, depends on what kind of line of business you're in. And, I think people are a little more careful about cleaning things nowadays. It's also easier to launder things. Anyway, it's an interesting question. By Rava asks, Dam urevav al bigdo mahu. What if you have, though, blood and fat on your garment? So the Gemara doesn't really understand this question. They say, I don't understand. Im tabachu typically mishum revav. If he's a tabach and he has blood and fat, well, slaughterers don't have fat on their clothes, so obviously you're going to have to take out the fat. And you're going to launder it anyway. You're going to get the blood out, but because you're getting the fat out. And imocher revavu, if he sells fats, then tepukle mishum dam. Well, then assume you have to take out the blood. So what kind of question is it? Obviously, you're going to have to launder it either which way. Lo tzricha de avid havaha. Here's this interesting question. What if you do both? Now, why is this a question? Well, if so, achada lo kapid atarte kapid. Maybe we say, look, a slaughterer doesn't mind if there's blood on his shirt. And a fat seller, or however you call it, I don't know, maybe just call him a wax seller according to some. Again, there's different interpretations what it is exactly. But maybe a wax seller, doesn't care about wax. But if you're selling both, maybe at a certain point your clothes are so dirty, both with wax and with blood, that you're going to care already, and you're going to want to clean your clothes. O dilma tartenami lo kapid, or maybe they just don't care about both of them, right? It doesn't bother them that they have both of those things on their garment. Irrelevant. So, how does the Gemara answer, and how do we end our chapter? Teiku. We're left with an unanswered question. With that, Hadrana Lafdam Chatan, and we finish the chapter and move on to our next topic. Now we're going to start this chapter with who can eat the korbanot, or really more like who can't eat from the korbanot. Okay, the kohanim, we're talking about the korbanot, the parts of the korban that go to the kohen, but who can't get parts of the meat? Normally, by the way, it was given out to the people who were on that week in the temple. But of those people, you might have someone who's in one of these categories that we're going to see is going to preclude him from getting any of the meat, or any of the other. We're going to talk about the hide and all the things that go to the kohen. So tful yom, if someone went to the mikveh that morning, they were impure, and they have to wait till nighttime till they become pure. Or mechusar kippurim, where it's their 8th day of, let's say, being a zav, and they did all their tefillah in the mikveh, but now they have to bring a sacrifice, and they haven't brought it yet, so they can't eat kachim yet. Einan cholkim b'kodashim le'echol la'erev. They can't get parts of the sacrifice, even though theoretically they can eat that night. The mechusar kippurim even theoretically could eat that day as soon as they bring their korbanot. Although Tosfot says from here, it seems like you actually also have to do tefillah and harev shemesh on day 8. There's a whole debate about that. Not getting into details, but either which way, they can't get kachim if at the moment they're supposed to bring their sacrifice. You can only get meat if you theoretically could have been involved in the sacrificial rites. If you can't, because you're disqualified for whatever reason, you're impure that day, even though the meat could still be eaten at night, you don't get a part of it. Onain, this is someone who's supposed to bury a relative. They're not allowed to work in the temple. Well, nogea, they can touch the meat because they're not impure. They don't carry impurity, but ino makriv. They can't sacrifice it because they can't sacrifice ino cholek lechol ha'erev. They can't have meat in the evening. Ba'alei mumim. Okay, here's a big exception to the rule. If you're a blemished kohen, bein ba'alei mumim avuim, bein ba'alei mumim fuim, whether you have permanent blemishes or non-permanent blemishes. Now, you can't work in the temple if you're blemished, a kohen who's blemished, but chokim ve'ochlim, okay? And Rashi tells us, in most of these cases, Rashi says, the Gemara is going to explain to us all this later, which we won't get to today, because today we're just doing the Mishnah. So, you're allowed to eat from the meat, even though theoretically you would say, based on what we learned so far, you can't do the sacrifice, you shouldn't be able to eat, but no, ba'alei mumim can. Aval lo makrivim, but they can't do the sacrifices. Kol she'eino ra'oi la'avodah, eino cholek bebasal. Now here they give this rule, even though it really doesn't sound like it fits with the Baal Mum. We're going to have to deal with this. But if you can't do avodah, then you can't get the meat. And kol she'ein lo bebasal, ein lo ba'orot. And if you can't get the meat, then you also don't get the hide. I mentioned that we talk about the hide, which also goes to the Kohen. You can't get that either. Afilu tamei b'shat zrikat amim v'tahor b'shat ikter chalavim eino cholek bebasal. Now we're going to, this we already kind of know, but we're now going to show it from a pasuk, which isn't so common. The Mishnah does that, and with that we'll end. Even if you're impure when it was time to sprinkle the blood, but you were impure, but when you can burn the meats, let's say you pushed off burning the fats until nighttime. You could do it at night. You could also do it during the day. You pushed it off till nighttime. It doesn't matter. Even if you, or whoever was doing it, pushed it off to nighttime, even if you're pure at the time that the fats are burned, because you weren't pure at the time of the sprinkling of the blood, you cannot eat the meat. You can't get a portion. Shneimar, where do we get it from? A pasuk. Hamakriv et damash lamim et achelev mi bnei Aaron. The one who brings the sacrifice, here's the key part, of the blood of the peace offering and the fats, okay, but both of them. Loti yes shokayamin lemana. To that person, you're going to get the shokayamin. That part is given to the Kohen, because the shlemim, the meat is actually eaten by the owners, but the shok, the thigh, is given to the Kohen. So from there we see only someone who could have sacrificed it, not someone who's not potentially able to sacrifice it. And with that, we finish our daf. We're going to do a quick review. We did these two different schools of thought of how to darshan that pasuk. Zot Torah la'olah mincha. What we learn from each one to the other. The first one we learned our halacha about the meat absorbing from the other meat and becoming like it, right, from like the sanctified meat. That we learned from the sin offering, but in the second one we learned it specifically from the mincha offering. And then we went through all the different halachot that we learned from each other. We then ended with two questions of Rava about blood in a garment. One had to do with the halacha we've been learning in this chapter about the blood in the garment that gets from the sacrificial blood, and the other is just talking about blood in a garment that could be an interposition for the mikveh and the garment if you need to purify the garment. Really unconnected, but similar because it was both cases with blood in a garment. From there, we got to the Mishnah, which talked about which kohanim are not allowed to get parts of the sacrificial meat, under what circumstances. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day. Like I said, a Chodesh Tov, Shavua Tov, and Chanukah Sameach.